Okay, so today we're diving into this episode of Anatomy of Murder, and
Yeah,
it's pretty heavy stuff, and I think it'll really get you thinking.
I'm ready.
So it's the story of Derek Dearman
Okay.
from Citronelle, Alabama.
Oh, yeah.
It took place back in 2016, and
Mhm.
basically this small town became the backdrop for this really horrific mass murder.
You know, it's funny. When violent crime happens in small towns, it always feels so much more jarring. It's
Yeah.
like everyone thinks of small towns as these safe havens, and then something like this happens, and it's like it bursts that bubble.
Yeah, totally agree. And what makes this case even more heartbreaking is the victims.
Yeah.
So we have Joseph and Shannon Turner, a young couple with their 3-month-old baby, Darren.
Oh, wow.
And then there's Justin and Chelsea Reed, also a couple, and they were expecting their first child. And then Robert Brown, he was a friend who was visiting.
But a full house, multiple generations,
Yeah,
friends.
exactly.
It's like a scene out of anyone's life, which just makes what happened all the more disturbing.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's Derek Dearman.
Okay.
He was involved with Lenita, who was Joseph's sister.
Okay.
And the podcast really portrays him as having this very volatile personality,
Mm-hmm.
especially toward Lenita.
So there's that domestic violence element here, which, as we know, can escalate so quickly.
Exactly. And Lenita, she's the key to this whole story.
Right.
She's the one who survived.
Oh, wow.
And her account of what happened is just, it makes the case so incredibly complex and disturbing.
You know, survivor accounts are always so powerful because
Mhm.
it's like they offer this window into the mind of someone who lived through the unimaginable.
Right.
It's hard to even fathom.
And there are so many layers to this case that just like grabbed me right from the start.
Yeah, what was it?
First off, there was no 911 call.
Right.
So how did anyone even know that this horrific crime had even happened?
That's unusual.
Yeah.
Usually there's a frantic call for help or a neighbor hears something, but
Hmm.
but complete silence, that's unsettling.
Exactly. And then there's the crime scene itself.
Yeah.
The podcast really goes into detail about the brutality of the murders, just the sheer violence involved.
It's often those details, the ones that stick with you long after you finish listening, that reveal the true darkness of a crime.
Right. And to make matters even worse, the baby, Darren and Lenita, were missing.
Oh, gosh.
So not only do you have this horrific crime scene,
Right.
but you have this added suspense of not knowing whether they're dead or alive.
The missing baby just adds this whole other level of urgency and anxiety to it. you know? It makes you question everything and just desperately hope for a good outcome.
And to really understand what happened, we have to go back to the days leading up to the massacre.
Okay.
So it all started when Lenita sought refuge at her brother's house. She was trying to get away from Derek's abuse.
This is where understanding the psychology of domestic violence is so crucial.
Yeah.
Victims often try to escape, but the abuser's control can extend far beyond physical proximity.
Right. And the podcast describes how, despite warnings, Derek kept showing up at the house,
Oh, wow.
demanding to see Lenita.
It's scary how persistent abusers can be.
You can just feel this tension building, this sense that something terrible is about to happen.
It's a classic cycle of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Even when victims try to assert their independence, the abuser often escalates their efforts to maintain control.
Yeah. And it's like on that Friday night, they had their friend, Robert Brown, over. They were cooking out, watching movies, just trying to have a normal evening.
And that normalcy, that contrast with the violence that's to come, is what makes true crime stories like this so unsettling.
Totally. And so everyone starts heading to bed. It's quiet, rural Alabama.
Yeah.
And then suddenly they hear these footsteps. Derek's back.
Oh my gosh, knowing what's coming, it's like a jump scare in a horror movie.
Right.
The dread you would feel in that moment must have been overwhelming.
So they told him to leave, and he said he'd spend the night nearby, but he kept coming back.
Oh.
It's like he was testing them, pushing their boundaries.
Yeah, it's a way for abusers to gauge their victims' resistance.
Yeah.
To see how much they can get away with.
And eventually Joseph, Anita's brother, he just puts his foot down.
Right.
He tells Derek that he's not welcome on the property, not even to spend the night.
You can feel his protective instincts kicking in,
Yeah.
trying to keep his sister safe.
Right. And they even called the police just to be safe.
Wow.
But by the time the officers arrived, Derek was gone.
Oh no.
Then it hit 3 a.m.
3 a.m., that time of night when everything feels just a little bit creepier.
Right. And Derek came back.
Oh my God.
He knocked on Lenita's window and asked her for a cigarette and a drink.
On the surface, those sound like harmless requests.
Right.
But knowing what we know about Derek and his behavior, it feels so calculated.
Totally. He knew Joseph and Shannon had had enough of him.
Yeah.
This was like a way to get Lenita outside, away from the others.
It's a classic manipulation tactic that abusers use,
Mm-hmm.
isolating their victims from their support systems.
Well, Lenita goes outside,
Oh my gosh.
gives him what he wants, and goes back to bed.
And she had no idea that wasn't the end of it.
Right.
That simple act, like giving him a cigarette and a drink, set in motion this chain of events that would forever change her life.
And what's crazy is that the authorities didn't even know that any of this had happened until Derek walked into a police station in Mississippi.
Oh, wow.
Hours later,
Yeah.
and confessed.
Confessed.
Yeah.
Just like that.
What was his explanation?
He claimed that he thought everyone in the house was trying to harm Lenita,
Hey, wow.
that they were kidnapping her.
Delusions, paranoia,
Yeah.
often used to justify horrific actions, you know?
Right.
It's a way to shift blame, create a narrative that fits their warped perspective.
Yeah, and so the authorities rushed to the house,
I bet.
and what they found was absolutely horrifying.
And for Ashley Rich, the district attorney, this wasn't just another case.
Right.
This was a personal mission to seek justice for the victims. She described the house. It was the small one-story place with children's toys scattered in the yard.
It's that image, the innocence of those toys,
Yeah.
against the backdrop of such unimaginable violence that really hits you in the gut.
I know, it's like that image really stuck with me too.
Wow.
And inside, the scene was just carnage.
Oh,
They found Robert Brown, the friend, in the living room.
okay.
He had been shot and had multiple axe wounds.
The fact that he was attacked with both a firearm and an axe suggests a level of rage
Right?
and intent to inflict pain. It wasn't just about killing, it was about something more sinister.
Down the hall, they found Justin and Chelsea Reed in their bedroom,
Oh my God.
also victims of the axe attack.
It makes you wonder about the chaos, the terror they must have felt in those final moments.
And Justin had defensive wounds,
Oh no.
suggesting he fought back to protect himself and his pregnant wife.
It's heartbreaking.
And in the other bedroom, they found Joseph and Shannon.
Oh gosh.
Shannon was still in bed, shot in the back of the head, likely while she slept.
It's hard to even fathom the suddenness, the brutality of such an act.
And amid all this horror, there's one detail that adds another layer of complexity.
What's that?
The baby, Darren and Lenita, were missing.
So the question becomes, did Lenita manage to escape during the attack?
Right.
Or was she taken by Derek? And what about the baby?
Yeah.
Was he alive?
Well, that's where the story takes this crazy, chilling turn.
Okay, now you've got me on the edge of my seat.
Yeah.
What happened to Lenita?
So it turns out she woke up to the sounds of the attack and, in a moment of pure terror and instinct, grabbed the baby and fled with Derek.
She fled with him
Yeah.
after witnessing what he had just done. That doesn't make sense.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But the podcast does a really good job of explaining the psychology behind her decision.
Okay.
She was caught between this need to survive,
Right.
to protect the baby, and the sheer terror of what Derek might do if she tried to escape.
It's that fight or flight response kicking in, but in a situation where there are no good options.
Exactly. So they took off in Shaman's car, the baby covered in blood, Lenita desperately trying to figure out her next move.
This is where the story goes from horrific to almost surreal.
Yeah.
It's like something out of a nightmare you can't wake up from.
Right.
So where did they go?
Well, they drove to Mississippi,
Okay.
first to Derek's sister's house, where he, concocted this story about hitting a deer to explain the blood.
Classic manipulation, trying to maintain control even as the walls are closing in.
And then they went to a friend's house, and this is where Lenita manages to leave the baby with the friend's parents.
Okay, so it's like she's creating some distance,
Yeah.
buying herself some time to think.
A glimmer of hope amidst the darkness.
Exactly. She's clearly thinking strategically, trying to find a way out of this nightmare.
Right. And eventually they end up at Derek's father's house.
Okay.
And it's there, while Derek's talking to his dad, that Lenita sees her opportunity.
This is the part where my heart is pounding.
Right.
What happened? Did she make it?
She does.
Oh, thank goodness.
She jumps in the car with the baby and drives straight back to Citronelle, heading directly for the police station.
What incredible courage.
I don't know, right?
To not only escape, but to also make sure that the baby was safe.
Yeah.
It makes you think about the strength of the human spirit, the will to survive, even in the face of unimaginable horror.
And that's how the authorities finally got confirmation of the horrific crime that had taken place just hours earlier.
Wow, but even with Derek in custody, the story was far from over.
Right.
So what happened next? What was the prosecution's approach to such a complex case?
Yeah.
Did his confession make things easier or harder?
Well, that's what we'll dive into next.
Okay.
The legal battle was just beginning,
Right.
and it would take some unexpected turns.
Okay.
So,
yeah,
stay tuned.
I'm hooked. So Derek Dearman, having confessed to these murders, he now faces the legal system. What happened next?
Well, this is where things took kind of surprising turns, so Derek decided to represent himself in court.
He chose to be his own lawyer.
Yeah.
That's so risky, even for someone with, like, legal experience, let alone someone facing charges this serious.
Right.
I mean, what was he thinking?
It's hard to say for sure, but the podcast kind of suggests it might have been a tactic to control the narrative.
Oh, I see.
To try to manipulate the jury.
Yeah, it does seem like a power play, right?
Yeah.
A way to try and take charge, even when he's the one on trial.
Exactly. And imagine, like, being a family member of one of the victims.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
And having to sit in that courtroom knowing that the man who orchestrated this entire tragedy is the one questioning witnesses and presenting arguments.
Oh, it must have been agonizing for them, adding another layer of pain and trauma to an already unbearable situation.
Totally. And he did have, like, shadow counsel,
Okay.
lawyers there to advise him.
Right.
But he was the one front and center.
So what was his defense strategy? Like, what kind of case was he trying to build for himself?
It's almost like he was trying to have it both ways.
What do you mean?
He admitted to the murders, but said drugs weren't an excuse. He even apologized to the victims' families, saying he wanted them to get justice.
That's a strange approach.
Yeah.
Like, on one hand, he's accepting responsibility, but on the other, there's this undercurrent of trying to garner sympathy, to position himself as remorseful.
Right, almost like he was trying to confuse the jury,
Right.
Make them question his true intentions.
Did it work?
Not really.
All right.
Ashley Rich, the district attorney, she saw right through it.
She suspected he was being manipulative, using this whole self-representation act to sway the jury.
Yeah.
To make them doubt his culpability. But with the confession, how difficult was it to secure a guilty verdict?
Well, the prosecution still had a lot to prove.
Oh, really?
Remember, this was a capital murder case.
Right.
Which means the death penalty was on the table.
Right.
So they needed to convince the jury that Derek's actions were premeditated and intentional, not just like a random act of violence fueled by drugs.
So it became this balancing act. They had to acknowledge the drug use, which the defense could use to argue diminished capacity, while also demonstrating the clear intent and planning behind the murders.
And they presented a lot of evidence to support their case.
Oh.
One of the most impactful was this 11-minute video of the crime scene.
Oh.
It showed the victims the brutality of the attacks.
I can only imagine how difficult that must have been to watch, especially for the victims' families. How did Derek react to seeing the video?
According to reports, he never even looked up at the screen.
That's chilling, almost like he was trying to distance himself from the reality of his actions.
Right.
To avoid confronting the consequences, did the prosecution use that to their advantage?
Absolutely. Ashley Rich argued that his lack of emotion, his detachment, showed he was a cold and calculating killer.
Right.
Not someone who was out of control due to drugs.
It becomes this battle not just of facts, but of perception. The prosecution wants the jury to see a cold-blooded murderer, while the defense is likely trying to present a more sympathetic figure.
Yeah.
Someone who made terrible mistakes, but deserves a chance at redemption.
Right, and to really drive home the severity of the crimes, the prosecution called a forensic pathologist to testify about the victim's injuries.
Oh, that's a powerful strategy.
Yeah.
It forces the jury to confront the brutal reality of the murders, to move beyond the legal arguments and connect with the human cost of Derek's actions.
Yeah. The pathologist described the extent of their suffering, the force used, the pain they endured.
It must have been a difficult testimony to hear.
Yeah.
But crucial for the prosecution's case.
And in the end, the jury saw through it.
Yeah.
They found Derek guilty on all 12 counts of capital murder.
12 counts. Why so many?
That's because in Alabama, there are specific laws that apply to capital murder cases.
I see.
Basically, Derek was charged with 2 counts for each victim.
So a guilty verdict on all charges.
Mm-hmm.
But this being a capital case, the battle wasn't over yet, right?
Exactly. The next phase was sentencing, where the prosecution presents reasons why Derek should receive the death penalty. And the defense presents reasons why he shouldn't.
It's like a second trial.
Right.
This time focused solely on the punishment.
Yeah, and for the prosecution, it was about showing the jury just how heinous and cruel these murders were, you know?
Right.
They wanted to demonstrate that this wasn't just a crime, it was an act of pure evil.
I can only imagine the emotional weight of this phase of the trial.
Right.
The victims' families, the jury, even the legal teams.
Yeah.
Everyone involved must have been carrying a heavy burden.
Totally.
Did they use the forensic pathologist's testimony again?
Yeah, they did. His detailed descriptions of the victim's suffering played a key role in highlighting the brutality and premeditation of the crimes.
So it was a battle of morality and justice.
Yeah.
The prosecution arguing that the severity of the crimes demanded the ultimate punishment, while the defense likely countered with pleas for mercy. Perhaps highlighting Derek's troubled past or potential for rehabilitation.
The jury deliberated and came back with a 12-0 recommendation for the death penalty.
A unanimous decision.
Yeah.
It seems the prosecution's arguments, coupled with the horrific nature of the crimes, convinced the jury that the death penalty was warranted in this case.
Right, but even with a sentence handed down, the story takes one final, unsettling turn.
Really?
Yeah.
What happened?
Even from death row, Derek couldn't let go of his need for control. He wrote a letter to Ashley Rich, the district attorney.
So even from death row, he was still trying to exert some kind of control. What do you think he was hoping to accomplish?
Well, the podcast doesn't actually reveal the contents of the letter.
Okay.
But it just seems like another attempt at manipulation, you know?
Yeah.
Like a way to try and influence how people viewed him, even after everything that had happened.
It's like he couldn't accept responsibility.
Right.
Like he couldn't face the consequences of his actions. He had to have the last word.
Yeah.
Try and shape his own narrative, even if it was just through, like, words on a page.
And it's just a reminder that justice isn't always about a verdict or a sentence, you know?
Right.
For those affected by these crimes, the pain, the trauma, the unanswered questions, it can linger for years.
It makes you think about the ripple effect of violence, how it extends outward,
Mm-hmm.
touching the lives of not just the victims, but their families, the community, even those who investigated and prosecuted the case.
And for Lenita, the sole survivor of this whole horrific ordeal, the journey to healing must have been incredibly difficult.
Yeah, her story is a testament to the strength of the human spirit,
Right.
the ability to find hope and resilience,
Yeah.
even in the darkest of circumstances.
Mm.
But it also raises some important questions about the lasting impact of trauma, the challenges of rebuilding a life after such unimaginable loss.
So we've talked about like the legal aspects of this case,
Right.
the prosecution strategy, the trial, the sentencing.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to step back and look at the bigger picture, the human element of this whole tragedy.
What stands out to you? What are the key takeaways that you think our listeners should really reflect on?
For me, it's the importance of recognizing the signs of domestic violence, understanding the complex dynamics of abuse, and knowing that help is available.
Right.
Lenita's story is a reminder that even in the most dangerous situations, there's always a chance to escape.
It's so important to remember that.
Yeah.
We often hear about these tragic cases and wonder why the victim didn't leave sooner.
Yeah.
But it's rarely that simple, you know?
Right.
Abuse can be incredibly insidious. It can chip away at a person's self-worth, their ability to make rational decisions.
Yeah.
It creates this web of fear and control that can be incredibly difficult to break free from.
And it's not just about the victims.
Right.
It's about the responsibility of friends, family members, even bystanders to recognize the signs of abuse and offer support.
Absolutely.
Sometimes just knowing that someone cares, someone's there to listen, can make all the difference.
This case also makes us think about the role of mental health, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
Derek's history of violence, his anger issues, well documented. It makes you wonder if there were missed opportunities for intervention,
Right.
if earlier treatment or support could have prevented this tragedy.
It's a question that haunts so many cases like this.
Yeah,
We can't change the past, but we can learn from it.
exactly.
By raising awareness about mental health, providing resources and support, maybe we can prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Derek Dearman case, what's the one thing you want our listeners to walk away with? What's the most important message?
I think it's about hope.
Hope.
Hope that even in the darkest of circumstances, there's always the possibility of escape, of healing, of justice.
Yeah.
It's about remembering the victims, honoring their memory, and learning from their stories. And it's about working together to create a world where violence and abuse have no place.
Beautifully said.
Thank you.
This has been a heavy deep dive.
It has.
A difficult story to grapple with, but you've done a great job guiding us through it all.
Oh, well, thank you.
Offering insights and perspectives that I think will really resonate with our listeners.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
And for our listener, if you find yourself wanting to explore this case further, I encourage you to check out that episode of Anatomy of Murder.
Yeah, definitely.
It's a really powerful piece of storytelling that will stay with you long after you finish listening.
And if you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out for help.
Yes.
There are resources available, people who care, and there's no shame in asking for support.
Absolutely.
Remember, you are not alone.